In this video, we're going to discuss average and standard deviation, or sometimes as they're otherwise known. Average can also be known as mean, and standard deviation sometimes is referred to as mean absolute deviation. And we'll talk about what those words mean here in a minute. I'm just letting you know that those terms can be used interchangeably. There are a lot of names for a lot of things in statistics, and what we're really looking into here is what the average or the mean is and what the standard deviation or the mean absolute deviation is. So let's start by looking at some hypothetical test scores. So let's say I'm a teacher, I give a group of kids this test, and these are the results. Out of a percentage, we have scores ranging from a 35 all the way up to 100, and we want to kind of use a single number to summarize this data set, and that's ultimately what these numbers are for. They're called summary statistics. And I'm sure if we think about the average, or the mean, if you prefer to call it that, I'm sure you know how to calculate that. You add up all of these numbers, and if you do that, you get 710, and then you divide by the number of test scores. In this case, there's conveniently 10 of them. So our average is going to equal 710 divided by 10, which is 71. Now that means that, on average, this class scored a 71. And if we think about what average really means, it's what we call in statistics a measure of center. So it doesn't necessarily mean that anyone in particular got a 71%. It doesn't mean that everyone got a 71%. It means that if we were to take all these points and divvy them up evenly, the students would receive a 71%. And it's a weird thought to really think about what average means because we use it so much. But ultimately, it's that idea of, okay, if everyone were to get an equal amount of points based on the total number that the whole group earned, what would that score be? And it's a way of usually saying that half of the students did better and about half did worse, usually. Now, sometimes that doesn't always happen. If there's a cluster up high or below, it might skew the average one way or the other. So it's what we call a statistical measure of center. In this case, we're looking at, on average, this group did 70 as a score of 71%. And it's useful because we can use this one number, the 71, to compare this class to, say, other classes. Now, let's look at standard deviation. So, standard deviation, at its core, we are looking at each of these data points. And we're going to ask ourselves, okay, how far are each of these from the average? And, well, let's start with the 70. This is 1 above, so a distance of 1 from the average. 75 is 4, 80 is 9, 90 would be 19, 95 would be 24, and 100 would be 29 away from the average. We're just using these as a way of saying, okay, how far off are each of these from the average? And we're going to do that with every data point. And we'll do the same thing on the low side. So if we think about a 65, that would be, 65 minus 71, that would be 6 away from our average. 55, that'd be 16. Then we have 26, and then we have 36. So the idea is, for standard deviation, you would add up all of these blue numbers and take an average of those. So a standard deviation, sometimes I abbreviate it as StanDev, is going to essentially be the average distance from the average. Now, this is something that normally you don't calculate by hand. This is one example where I'm going to do it to show you what it is. Now, largely, if you're talking 100 data points, you would literally be here all day just calculating this one thing. Now, thankfully, we have technology, we have spreadsheets to where we can plug this in and we can just say, find the standard deviation, and we have the number. I'm not so much worried about the ability to do it. I'm more worried about, once you have it, what can you do with it? So if you go ahead and add up all these blue numbers that I've circled in green, you'll get that the total is 200. And it's worth noting that all these numbers are positive. We're just worried about a distance here, how far they are. Now, that would be the total number. There are 10 of these data points in general, so we're going to divide that by 10 to get our standard deviation. And that would be 20. Now, what this 20 means is that, okay, on average, each student is 20 points, or within 20 points of the 71%. Now, again, it's an average. If we were to take the distance from the average and spread it evenly, they'd all be within 20 points of it. Now, it's a way of measuring spread. How varied is my data set? And a higher number just means there's more spread. My data set might not be very close to the average, or it might be closer. If it's a lower number, it would mean it's closer. Now, again, we're more worried about the interpretation here. So let's talk about the meaning. So let's suppose that class A, that's the class we just calculated the average and standard deviation for. Now, this is the part that's really important, or where it really comes into play. Sometimes all I'm going to have is these summary statistics for other classes. All I know is the average and the standard deviation for Class B and Class C. I don't know about the data set. I can't look at the entirety of the class. And for all I know, there could be hundreds and hundreds of scores to look through. So it's very difficult to look at how well these classes compare. And if I'm trying to determine which class did better, that can be kind of difficult to determine with whatever I have. Now, however, if I'm looking at just the statistics, what they really mean. Class A, I have an average of 71 and a standard deviation of 20. Class B, I have an average of 75 and a standard deviation of 30. Let's just compare those two for a second. So, Class B technically has a higher average, which might lead you to believe it has higher scores. However, it has a wider variation, a greater standard deviation, meaning that on average, more of those scores were further away from the average. So it means I have more scores either higher or lower, I don't know which, than the Class A data set that we just looked at. So did they do better, did they do worse? I'm not entirely sure. It can be a little difficult to determine in this case. And that's something we have to be very careful about saying. So if we look at Class C, the average is 70, but the standard deviation is 5. Now, knee-jerk reaction, if we just look at the average, we can say, okay, yeah, Class C, fairly comparable to our Class A. However, if we look at that standard deviation is very low, meaning that on average, students were within 5 points of 70, meaning that they were probably within the 65 to 75 range, if we think about what that would mean. Whereas if we look at Class B, we're looking at anywhere from 45 to theoretically 105. Now we know that 105 is not possible, but just sometimes when we think about variation, we don't necessarily meet the context. So probably we could safely say between 45 and 100. And if we look at our original class, we're within 51 to 91. And this can give you an idea of, okay, where most people fall given these. And it's very difficult in this middle class to really kind of make any kind of deduction. Yeah, you could be anywhere from a 45% to 100%. This one, you could be anywhere from 51% to 91%. And this one, you're anywhere from 65 to 75. Now, that's not saying that all the scores are there, but just a good portion of them will be within that standard deviation. So if we think about as a whole, which class did the best? And I mean, it all depends on kind of how you argue it in this case, and it's hypothetical. I would think our best class, at least for the most consistent, would be Class C. We know that their group is right in there with the 65 to 75. And that's not to say that you don't have some very good scores. It just means that largely you have a good cluster in the middle. Then I would probably say our next safest bet would probably be Class A, just given the summary statistics, what we know. We know that what the pack looks like. We know that that's where most of our students are. And then Class B probably is our third. But we could have some very high scores in there. We could have some very low scores in there. We just don't know about it. So we would need some more information on this one. So ultimately, we're not so much worried about calculating the average. We're not so much worried about calculating standard deviation. It's what can you do with it. And remember, average is a measure of center. Standard deviation is a measure of spread. And it's a very simple idea at its core, but it's very complex when you start trying to think about what you can do with it.